My name is Nadia Fisher. I'm 36 years old. For most of my life, I was introduced as the steady one, the dependable daughter, the reasonable sister, the calm presence in a room that didn't always know how to be calm. Or at least I lived in Portland, Oregon. I worked as a financial compliance analyst for a mid-sized firm downtown. On paper, that sounds impressive. Structured, responsible. And I suppose I am those things. But inside my own home, inside the family I grew up in, I was something much smaller. I was the one who adjusted, the one who smoothed things over, the one who stayed. People often assume quiet women are either fragile or endlessly patient. I am neither. I simply learned early that volume is not the same thing as strength, and that being needed is not the same thing as being valued. From the outside, my life looked stable. I lived in the house I grew up in. I helped with the mortgage after my father's health declined. I managed bills, appointments, and paperwork. I kept things running. I told myself that loyalty meant endurance, but endurance has a cost. This story isn't about a dramatic fight at the dinner table. It isn't about screaming matches or shattered glass. There were no villains in capes, no cinematic betrayals, just small moments, repeated patterns, tiny dismissals that gathered quietly like dust in the corners of a room no one bothered to clean. Until one day I did something no one expected. I walked out empty-handed. I threw down my keys, and I said very calmly, "From now on, I am no longer part of this family." There was no rage in my voice, no shaking hands, just clarity. With nothing but my resolve, I walked away from the only home I had ever known, and from the family that no longer felt like mine. This isn't a revenge story. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because something inside me shifted so quietly that no one noticed until it was too late. What you're about to hear is not dramatic. It's honest. It's about the slow erosion of belonging, about how invisibility can become a role you're assigned, and how stepping out of that role can feel like both a loss and a liberation. I'm not here to justify myself. I'm here to tell you what it feels like when you realize that staying loyal to others has required betraying yourself. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize something familiar. Have you ever stayed somewhere long after you stopped feeling seen? If you asked my family who I was, they would never describe me as the problem. They would say I was reliable. They would say I was mature. They would say Nadia always handles it. And that sentence, spoken with casual certainty, was the beginning of everything. In our house, my mother was emotional. My younger brother, Ethan, was impulsive. My father, before his health declined, was decisive in the way men of his generation often are. Quiet authority, rarely questioned. After his stroke, that authority dissolved into frustration. The house shifted, the balance changed. And I stepped in, not because anyone formally asked me to. No one sat me down and said, "We need you to carry this." It was more subtle than that. Bills began arriving unopened, medical paperwork piled up, insurance letters went unanswered. My mother would sigh at the kitchen table and say, "I don't understand any of this." Ethan would shrug. "Nadia's good with that stuff." And just like that, it became mine. At first, I didn't mind. I was proud of being capable. I worked in compliance. Rules and systems made sense to me. There was comfort in fixing what others found overwhelming. I told myself this was adulthood. This was family. But capability has a shadow. When you are competent, people stop checking whether you are tired. When you are calm, people assume you are unaffected. When you rarely complain, people forget you have limits. In family gatherings, I was the one refilling glasses, clearing plates, mediating small disagreements before they become large ones. If Ethan forgot to pick up groceries, I went. If mom felt overwhelmed, I listened. If dad needed help with physical therapy exercises, I rearranged my schedule. No one forced me, and that's the part that makes this story uncomfortable. I volunteered, I adjusted, I absorbed. Over time, something invisible formed around me. An expectation, not gratitude. Expectation. If I ever hesitated, even slightly, there was confusion in the air, not anger, just a surprise. "You're not gonna handle it?" It wasn't accusatory, it was bewildered. As though the idea that I might not always be available simply didn't fit into the family narrative. I became the infrastructure of the house, essential, unnoticed. When relatives visited, they praised my mother for holding everything together. They told Ethan he would grow into responsibility one day. They patted my father's shoulder and spoke gently about recovery. And me? You've always been so independent, Nadia. Independent. As if I existed outside the emotional economy of the family. As if I required nothing. I remember one Thanksgiving when an aunt leaned toward me and said, "You don't need much, do you? You've always been so low maintenance." She meant it as a compliment. I smiled. I even laughed softly. But something about that phrase stayed with me. Low maintenance. It sounds efficient, easy, convenient. It also means we don't have to tend to you. At work, my voice carried weight. When I flagged financial inconsistencies, executives listened. When I said a risk was unacceptable, action followed. At home, my voice was logistical. What time is the appointment? Did you sign the form? We can refinance at a lower rate. I spoke in solutions, not feelings. And because I did not dramatize my needs, it became easy to assume I had none. There is a particular loneliness in being the stable one. You are surrounded by people who rely on you, yet rarely wonder what supports you. Still, I stayed. I told myself this was what love looked like, showing up over and over again, without needing applause. What I didn't yet understand was that there is a difference between being needed and being valued. And I had quietly become indispensable, but not seen. The first cut wasn't loud. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no accusation sharp enough to leave an immediate scar. It was a Tuesday evening in early October. Rain is tapping lightly against the kitchen windows. I had just come home from work, still wearing my blazer, my laptop bag heavy on my shoulder. I remember the smell of overcooked pasta. Mom was at the stove. Ethan was scrolling through his phone at the table. Dad was in the living room, the television low but constant. "Nadia?" Mom called without turning around. "Did you call the insurance company?" I hadn't. I had worked through lunch that day to finish a quarterly report. I had answered 3 compliance escalations. I had stayed an hour late. "I didn't get to it today," I said, setting my bag down. "I can do it tomorrow." There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. Mom sighed. Not dramatically, just disappointed. "Oh, I told them you'd handle it." Ethan didn't look up from his phone. "Yeah, they've been waiting." I hadn't known anyone was waiting. I stood there for a moment, still in my heels, feeling something small press against my chest. Not anger, not yet, just a flicker of something unfamiliar. "I'll call first thing in the morning," I replied calmly. Mom shook her head slightly. "It's just stressful when things don't get done. I don't know how to deal with those people." There was no thank you for the hundreds of calls I had already made over the past year. No acknowledgement that this was one delay, one day. Just the gentle implication that I had dropped something essential. I told myself it was nothing. Families rely on each other. Of course they do. Of course I was the one who handled these things. I was the most equipped. But as I changed out of my work clothes later that night, I replayed the moment in my mind. I hadn't said I wouldn't do it. I hadn't refused. I had simply not completed a task on someone else's timeline, and the air in the room had shifted. At dinner, the conversation flowed around me. Ethan talked about a weekend trip he was planning with friends. Mom discussed a neighbor's renovation. Dad asked about the weather forecast. No one asked about my day. They rarely did. Again, not out of cruelty, just habit. I was the one who listened, the one who solved, the one who adjusted. Halfway through the meal, Mom looked at me again. "Make sure you don't forget tomorrow, okay?" There it was. Not a request. A reminder. As if I were prone to irresponsibility. As if I needed supervision. I nodded once. I won't. And I meant it. But something about being reminded, after years of handling everything, felt like being gently reduced. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, my laptop open. I logged into the insurance portal and drafted the information they would need in the morning. I prepared notes, organized documents. As I typed, I noticed something unsettling. I wasn't doing this out of generosity anymore. I was doing it to avoid their disappointment, to prevent that soft sigh, that subtle shift in tone. That quiet narrative was that I had failed to meet an unspoken standard. It was the first time I felt the weight of expectation without the warmth of appreciation. And the first time I asked myself a question, I quickly pushed away. If I stopped doing these things, what would happen? Would the house fall apart? Or would they simply find someone else to lean on? The next morning, I made the call before 9 a.m. I resolved the issue in 14 minutes. When I texted Mom to let her know it was handled, she responded with a thumbs up emoji. Not thank you, just confirmation. That small blue icon stayed on my screen longer than it should have. It was such a tiny thing. A sigh, a reminder, a thumbs up. But that was the first cut. And what I didn't yet understand was how many small cuts a person can absorb before they begin to bleed internally. The strange thing about small cuts is that they don't demand immediate attention. You don't rush to the mirror, you don't call for help. You tell yourself it's barely noticeable. You move on. And that's how it continued. The insurance call became one of dozens of invisible tasks that slid quietly into my column of responsibility. Doctor follow-ups, utility negotiations, property tax appeals, Ethan's parking ticket, Dad's prescription refill error, Mom's online banking password reset. Each one is small, each one is reasonable. Individually, none of them felt unfair. Collectively, they formed a pattern. One Saturday morning, Ethan knocked on my bedroom door. "Hey," he said casually, leaning against the frame. "Can you look over my lease agreement? I think my landlord's trying to sneak something in." I had planned to spend that morning catching up on sleep. I'd worked late all week. "Sure," I said, sitting up. "Email it to me." He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The exchange felt pre-approved by the universe. An hour later, I had annotated the document, highlighted problematic clauses, and drafted a response he could send. When I handed my laptop back to him in the kitchen, he skimmed it and said, "Cool," like I'd passed him the salt. That word echoed longer than it should have. Cool. At work, when I completed a complex audit review, my manager sent detailed praise. There were performance bonuses, public acknowledgement in meetings. At home, my competence dissolved into background noise. It wasn't malicious. It was normalization. The more I did, the less extraordinary it became. My effort flattened into expectation. And because I didn't protest, the expectation grew. One evening, Mom announced at dinner, "Nadia's going to handle refinancing the house." I looked up from my plate. "I am?" She smiled. "You understand that stuff. It'll be easier if you just take care of it." There it was again. Just take care of it. No discussion, no question about my bandwidth. Just a smooth assignment delivered as fact. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense." I felt a brief tightening in my chest. I could have spoken up. I could have said, "Let's talk about that." I could have asked for shared responsibility. Instead, I heard myself respond, "Okay, I'll look into options." Why? Because I was good at it. Because conflict made my mother anxious. Because Ethan would likely do it poorly and create more work later. Because somewhere deep inside, I believed that my value in this family was tied to how smoothly I could prevent disruption. So I rationalized. They're stressed. Dad's health isn't what it used to be. Ethan is still figuring things out. Mom gets overwhelmed easily. I told myself I was stronger, more stable, that absorbing pressure was simply my role. But strength without boundaries slowly turns into self-erasure. The dismissals became more subtle. If I disagreed with a decision, it was brushed aside with, "You worry too much." If I suggested a different plan, it became, "Let's not overcomplicate it." My input was valued when it solved problems, less so when it challenged direction. I began to notice something uncomfortable. They didn't actually see me as a person with evolving needs. They saw me as a function, a system, an internal service department. And because I rarely raised my voice, rarely expressed frustration, my silence was interpreted as consent. The night that realization settled in, I was sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I tried to recall the last time someone in my family had asked genuinely, "How are you doing?" Not, "Did you handle it?" Not, "Can you check this?" Not, "Are you free to?" Just, "How are you?" I couldn't remember, and still I stayed. Because leaving felt extreme. Because nothing was technically abusive. Because from the outside, we were a normal family navigating stress. The disrespect was quiet, so quiet it almost felt imaginary. But it wasn't loudness that hurt. It was the slow realization that my reliability had become a reason not to care whether I was overwhelmed. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. That was the moment I began to understand something I had avoided for years. I had helped build a role that was slowly making me disappear. There's a moment when you stop reacting to individual incidents and begin to see the architecture, the structure underneath. For me, that realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. I wasn't just helping my family. I had been assigned a role. Not formally, not maliciously, but undeniably. I was the responsible one, the buffer, the translator between chaos and stability. And roles once established are rarely questioned, especially when they benefit everyone else. I began noticing how conversations formed around me. If something complicated surfaced, all eyes subtly shifted in my direction. "Nadia will know." "Nadia can fix it." "Let Nadia look at it." It was spoken with confidence, almost pride. But underneath that confidence was an assumption. I wasn't consulted about whether I wanted to carry these things. I was positioned as the natural endpoint for them. One Sunday afternoon, my mother was on the phone with a distant relative discussing estate planning. I overheard her from the hallway. "Oh, I don't worry about that," she said lightly. "Nadia handles all our financial matters." I paused. Handles all our financial matters. The phrasing struck me. Not helps, not supports, handles. As though I were an employee in my own childhood home. When she hung up, I asked gently, "Mom, did you tell Aunt Carol that I manage everything?" She looked confused. "Well, you do. You're good at it. That doesn't mean it's automatically mine," I said, keeping my tone even. She frowned slightly. "Why are you being sensitive? I was complimenting you." Sensitive? That word closed the conversation before it could begin. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I recognized something deeper. My discomfort was inconvenient. And inconvenience was not a role I had permission to occupy. Over time, I started to see how the family ecosystem functioned. Ethan was allowed mistakes. They were framed as growth. He's still learning. My mother was allowed to be overwhelmed. It was framed as fragility. She's under a lot of stress. My father was allowed silence. It was framed as dignity. And me? I was allowed competence. Only competence. If I showed fatigue, it disrupted the balance. If I hesitated, it created tension. If I declined, it felt like betrayal. Reliability had become my cage. I realized something unsettling one evening while reviewing refinancing documents at the dining table. If I disappeared for a week, no explanations, no arrangements, the house would not function smoothly. Bills would be late, calls unanswered, paperwork ignored, not because my family was incapable of learning, but because they had never needed to. My presence had insulated them from consequences, and somewhere along the way, that insulation became expected. I thought back to childhood. I had always been the self-sufficient one, packing my own lunches, completing assignments early, not causing trouble. Adults praised me for it. "She's so easy." Easy! I carried that word into adulthood like a badge of honor. But easy for whom? I began to understand that being easy often meant being quiet about discomfort, being adaptable, absorbing friction so others didn't have to feel it. In family systems, the person who absorbs the most tension often looks the strongest. But strength without recognition slowly turns into invisibility. I wasn't being abused. I wasn't being shouted at. I was being relied upon in a way that left no room for me to exist beyond utility. That realization didn't explode inside me. It settled, like a stone placed carefully in my palm. I could ignore it, or I could acknowledge its weight. For the first time, I asked myself something radical. What if my role wasn't who I was? What if I had confused usefulness with identity? And more importantly, what would happen if I stopped performing it? The question lingered, not yet a decision. Just a quiet shift. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after an insult. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening, in the most unremarkable way. I was standing in the hallway outside my parents' bedroom, holding a stack of medical statements I had just organized. The house was dim. The television murmured in the background. Ethan was laughing at something on his phone in the kitchen. I had spent 2 hours correcting a billing error from Dad's physical therapy provider. 2 hours navigating automated menus, waiting on hold, explaining codes and coverage limits. When I finally resolved it, the representative said, "You're very thorough. Most people would have given up." I almost laughed. Most people would have given up. The phrase followed me into the hallway. I knocked lightly and stepped into my parents' room. Mom looked up from folding laundry. "It's sorted," I said gently. "They reversed the extra charges." She smiled in relief. "Oh, good. I knew you'd figure it out." Belle! I waited. Not for praise, just acknowledgement. She returned to folding towels. "That was it." "No, thank you for spending your evening on that." "No, are you tired?" "No, we appreciate you." Just certainty. I stood there longer than necessary, still holding the folder. And for the first time, something inside me didn't feel hurt. It felt clear. It was like watching a play you've seen too many times. The lines were predictable, the reactions rehearsed. I realized that if I stayed in this house for another 10 years, the script would not change. Not because my family didn't care about me, but because the system worked for them. And systems rarely evolve when they're comfortable. Later that night, I sat alone at the dining table. The refinancing documents spread out in front of me. My laptop screen reflected faintly in the dark window behind it. I closed it. I didn't finish the application. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the table and asked myself something I had avoided for years. If I stopped doing all of this tomorrow, who would I be? Not to them, to myself. The question felt disorienting. My entire adult identity within this house was built on stability, on being the one who handled things. But stability had slowly replaced intimacy. Responsibility had replaced reciprocity. I thought about my life outside these walls. At work, I was respected. My expertise was compensated. My boundaries were acknowledged. If I declined a project because my workload was full, no one called me sensitive. If I said that timeline isn't realistic, people adjusted. Why was it easier to assert myself in a corporate boardroom than at my own dinner table? The answer was uncomfortable. Because at work, my value wasn't emotional. At home, it was. And somewhere along the way, I had equated love with performance. That Wednesday night, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no tears, just a quiet realization. I was not trapped. I was choosing to stay. And if I were choosing, then I could also choose differently. The power of that thought was almost frightening. It meant I was no longer a victim of circumstance. It meant the discomfort I felt wasn't inevitable. It was negotiable. I walked to the front door before going to bed. I picked up my silver house key from the small ceramic dish near the entryway. I held it in my palm. For years, that key represented belonging, responsibility, home. But as I stood there in the quiet, it felt different. It felt like access, and access can be revoked, not by others, by yourself. That was the night something fundamental shifted inside me. Not anger, not resentment, just the calm awareness that I no longer wanted to live as infrastructure. I wanted to live as a person. And once you see that possibility, you can't unknow it. After that Wednesday, I didn't announce a transformation. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw dramatically. From the outside, nothing shifted. Inside, everything did. The difference was subtle but profound. My silence was no longer automatic. It became intentional. The following week, another small request arrived. "Nadia!" Mom called from the kitchen. "Can you set up that online portal for the new medical provider? I can't figure it out." I was in the living room reading through a compliance update from work. Normally, I would have stood up immediately. Instead, I paused, not in defiance, in assessment. "Can you try walking through it while I sit with you?" I asked calmly. She hesitated. "I'll mess it up." "I'll be right there," I replied. "But you can click." It was a tiny shift, almost invisible. She frowned slightly, but agreed. For the first time, I didn't take the mouse from her hand. I watched, guided, let her struggle through password requirements and security questions. It took 15 minutes longer than if I had done it myself. But when it was finished, she said, "Oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought." I nodded. It usually isn't. Ethan noticed the change next. One Saturday afternoon, he tossed a car insurance notice onto the coffee table. "Can you check if this rate makes sense?" I didn't pick it up. "You can compare it online," I said evenly. "There are calculators." He blinked. "Yeah, but you're better at that." "That's true," I agreed calmly. "But you're capable." There was no accusation in my voice, no irritation, just a fact. He stared at the envelope for a moment, as if it had personally offended him. "Fine," he muttered. And he took it back to his room. The house didn't collapse. No one shouted. But I could feel the subtle confusion in the air. It was as though the furniture had shifted half an inch, and no one could quite place why the room felt different. My silence, my stillness began to carry weight. Not the old silence, the one that absorbed. A new one. Measured. Strategic. I stopped volunteering solutions during dinner conversations. If someone mentioned a problem, I listened without immediately offering to fix it. At first, the gaps in conversation stretched awkwardly. Mom would glance at me, waiting for input. Ethan would look mildly irritated. Dad would simply watch. I held eye contact. Soft, neutral. If they asked directly, I responded. If they didn't, I let the silence breathe. What fascinated me most was how quickly my absence from the problem-solving role created discomfort. Not hostility. Discomfort. Because they were used to me stepping in before the inconvenience matured. Now inconvenience lingered a little longer. One evening, Mom sighed over a confusing utility bill. I sipped my tea. She glanced at me. I met her eyes. "Do you want help?" I asked. "Oh." The phrasing was deliberate. Not "I'll handle it." Not "give it to me." "Do you want help?" She studied me for a second as if recalibrating. "Yes," she said finally. "Okay," I replied. "Let's look at it together." Together. That word began appearing in my vocabulary more often. But I noticed something else too. The more I stopped over-functioning, the more my family interpreted it as distance. "Are you stressed at work?" Mom asked one night. "You seem quieter." "I'm just thinking," I said gently. Ethan joked once. Don't tell me you're too good for us now. I smiled faintly. I've always been good for you. He laughed, not quite catching the edge in the truth. They mistook my recalibration for moodiness, for fatigue, for the temporary withdrawal. They didn't recognize it as what it truly was, reclaiming space. The most powerful part? I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was simply no longer reflexively available. And because I didn't dramatize the shift, they had nothing obvious to confront. They couldn't accuse me of hostility. All I had done was pause before saying yes. Then that pause became my quiet boundary. And in that space, between request and response, I began to feel something unfamiliar. Authority. Not over them, over myself. The house still functioned. Tasks still got done. But the emotional equation was no longer automatic. For the first time in years, I was not performing my role. I was observing it. And when you step outside a role long enough, you begin to see how fragile it actually is. When people are used to you being predictable, they stop watching closely. That was my advantage. Outwardly, I was still Nadia, calm, responsible, present at dinner, available when spoken to. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. But internally, something had shifted from reflection to preparation. Not revenge. Preparation. It began with numbers. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, I reopened documents I had once handled automatically. The mortgage, utility accounts, property taxes, insurance policies. I didn't review them as the dutiful daughter anymore. I reviewed them as a stakeholder. For the first time, I asked questions I had avoided. Whose name is on what? Who is legally responsible for which payments? What would happen if I stopped contributing? What protections do I actually have? The answers were clarifying. The mortgage was primarily in my parents' names, but I had been transferring a fixed amount monthly for years. No formal agreement, just family understanding. Utilities? Mostly under my name, because it was easier when I set them up. Insurance contacts? Me. Medical billing contact? Me. Emergency contact forms? Me. I had slowly become administratively embedded in the structure of the house. Not emotionally, operationally, and yet legally, I own nothing. That detail didn't make me angry. It made me aware. One evening, I opened a separate savings account. Not secret in a dramatic way, just separate. A quiet compartment of autonomy. I adjusted my direct deposit, so a percentage of my salary flowed there automatically. No announcement, no justification, just structure. At work, I began volunteering for a leadership certification program I had postponed for years because home was too busy. I stayed later, not to avoid my family, but to expand myself. I updated my resume, not because I planned to quit, because I wanted to see in writing who I was beyond that house. The document startled me. Compliance specialist, risk analyst, financial strategist, competent, valuable, independent. None of those descriptors included daughter. I also started documenting something else. Not arguments, patterns, dates when I was assigned responsibilities without consultation, instances where financial contributions were assumed, conversations where my hesitation was labeled as sensitivity. Not to weaponize. To clarify, I needed to know I wasn't imagining the imbalance. Seeing it written down removed the emotional fog. There was a rhythm to it. Request, compliance. Expectation increases. Rarely. Appreciation, reciprocity. Inquiry about my well-being. I began having quiet conversations with myself during my morning commute. If I left this house, what would actually happen? Financially, I could afford an apartment. Logistically, I could transfer utilities back to the appropriate names. Emotionally, that was more complicated. I wasn't preparing to run. I was preparing to choose. There's a difference. One Saturday afternoon, I toured a small one-bedroom apartment downtown. I told my family I was running errands. The unit wasn't luxurious. Exposed brick, large windows, hardwood floors that creaked slightly. But when I stepped inside, something unusual happened. There was no history in the air. No expectations. No invisible role waiting for me to resume. Just empty space. The leasing agent spoke about square footage and security deposits. I barely heard him. I was imagining silence that wasn't loaded. Evenings that weren't structured around preventing problems. A kitchen counter that only held my responsibilities. I didn't sign anything that day. I simply gathered information. Back at home that night, dinner unfolded as usual. Ethan complained about work. Mom worried about an upcoming appointment. Dad watched quietly. And I observed, not with resentment, with detachment. They didn't notice the shift because I hadn't withdrawn love. I had withdrawn automatic availability. And in that space, I was building something they couldn't see. Independence backed by documentation. Financial clarity. Options. Options are powerful, especially when no one knows you have them. By the end of that month, I had enough saved for a security deposit and 3 months of rent. Not because I was fleeing, because I was preparing for the possibility that staying might no longer align with who I was becoming. The most dangerous assumption in any system is that the reliable person will remain indefinitely. They never noticed that I had stopped assuming the same. The private reveal didn't come from discovering hidden money. It didn't come from uncovering betrayal. It came from reading a document I had signed years ago without thinking. It was a Sunday afternoon, rain against the windows again. The house is quiet except for the steady hum of the dryer downstairs. I was organizing digital copies of household documents, something I had done dozens of times before. But this time I wasn't organizing as the dutiful daughter. I was auditing. Buried in an old email thread from 5 years earlier was the refinancing agreement we had completed after my father's stroke. I remembered the stress of that time. Medical bills are stacking up. My mother is overwhelmed. Ethan is still in college. I had stepped in, of course. I opened the PDF slowly. There it was. A clause I had skimmed back then, because I trusted the narrative surrounding it. Contributing party acknowledges payments are considered voluntary family support and do not confer ownership interest. Voluntary. No ownership interest. I stared at the sentence for a long time. For 5 years, I had contributed nearly a third of the monthly mortgage payment, not as rent, not under a tenant agreement, as voluntary support. Legally, it meant I could walk away without liability. Emotionally, it meant something else. It meant the structure had always been clear. I had chosen to blur it. The reveal wasn't that I had been tricked. It was that I had mistaken contribution for equity. I had assumed that years of financial support translated into belonging with weight. But legally, I was a guest with a generous wallet. The clarity was almost peaceful. There was no surge of anger, no sense of injustice. Just alignment. If I stayed as a helper. If I left, I owed nothing beyond love. And love cannot be invoiced. Later that week, I scheduled a quiet consultation with a real estate attorney during my lunch break. Not to initiate conflict, simply to understand. What would happen if I stopped contributing to a family mortgage I'm not legally tied to? I asked. He reviewed the paperwork. You'd have no legal obligation, he said plainly. Your payments have been gifts. Gifts. The word settled gently. Would I be liable for utilities under my name? I asked. Only until you transfer or close the accounts. It was procedural, clean, simple. I left his office not empowered in a dramatic way, but steady. For the first time, I understood the true shape of my position. I was not trapped. I was not financially entangled beyond repair. The only thing binding me was expectation. And expectation dissolves when participation stops. That night at dinner, Ethan casually mentioned upgrading his car. Mom worried aloud about rising costs. Dad asked whether refinancing again might lower payments. All eyes turned toward me. The reflexive shift. I felt it. And for the first time, I didn't feel obligated. I think everyone should review their own budgets first, I said evenly. It's good practice. There was a flicker of surprise. You usually run the numbers for us, Mom said. I've shown you how, I replied gently. The conversation moved on, slightly awkward, but inside me, something had solidified. I didn't need leverage in the dramatic sense. I didn't need evidence of wrongdoing. The leverage was structural. I was the operational center of the house. And I had the legal freedom to step away. Quiet dominance isn't about threatening departure. It's about knowing you can leave without collapsing. Over the next few days, I transferred utilities into my parents' names under the guise of simplifying paperwork. I removed my automatic mortgage transfer and set a reminder instead of auto draft. No announcements, no speeches, just repositioning. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It was mathematical. I'd mistaken obligation for permanence. And once I saw that clearly, the house felt different. Not hostile, just temporary. I walked past the ceramic dish near the front door and picked up my silver key again. For years, it had symbolized responsibility. Now it symbolized choice. And choice changes everything. There's a moment when preparation stops being theoretical, when options stop being comforting ideas and start demanding selection. For me, that moment arrived on a quiet Thursday evening. Mom had just received notice that property taxes were increasing. The letter lay open on the kitchen counter, heavy with implication. Nadia, she called softly, we need to figure this out. I walked into the kitchen, drying my hands on a dish towel. Ethan was there too, leaning against the fridge. Dad sat at the table, silent but attentive. Mom slid the letter toward me. Normally, I would have reached for it automatically. Instead, I looked at her first. What are you thinking? I asked. Wad sitin. She blinked, caught off guard. I thought you'd tell us. There it was again, the gravitational pull of my old role. Ethan added, maybe we refinance again? Mia. Dad sighed. Rates aren't great. All reasonable comments. All orbiting the assumption that I would centralize the solution. I picked up the letter, scanned it calmly, and placed it back down. There are a few options, I said evenly. Increase household contributions, adjust spending, consider downsizing in a few years. The word downsizing landed like a dropped glass. Mom's face tightened. We're not selling this house. I didn't say you had to, I replied gently. I said it's an option. Silence. I could feel the unspoken tension building. Not explosive, but unsettled. And in that quiet, I felt the fork in the road. Option 1. Continue. Increase my contribution to offset the tax rise. Maintain stability. Preserve comfort. Remain the quiet backbone. Option 2. Reduce my financial involvement gradually. Allow the system to adjust. Create space without confrontation. Option 3. Leave. Not in anger. In alignment. I saw the future in quick flashes. If I stayed and absorbed the increase, the pattern would solidify permanently. My contribution would be expected indefinitely. If I slowly withdrew without leaving, tension would stretch for months. Confusion, guilt, subtle resentment. If I left cleanly, the shock would be sharp but finite. The irreversible option is often the clearest. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat at the dining table alone again. The house felt familiar, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside. I imagined myself 5 years older, still here, still steady, still responsible, still explaining billing codes over dinner. Would I resent them by then? Not loudly, but quietly. And quiet resentment corrodes slowly. I opened my laptop and revisited the apartment listing I had saved. The exposed brick, the light. Availability, immediate. My finger hovered over the schedule viewing button again. I closed my eyes. This wasn't about punishing my family. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about refusing to continue a dynamic that required my self-erasure. The next morning before work, I scheduled the viewing. 2 days later, I signed the lease. No announcement, no confrontation. Just a decision executed calmly. The lease agreement felt different from the documents I handled at home. This one had my name clearly printed under tenant, not voluntary support, not the contributing party. Tenant, responsible only for myself. When I left the leasing office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet gravity. Because leaving isn't just logistics, it's identity. For the first time, my future was not anchored to that house. The irreversible option had been chosen, and no one at the dinner table that evening had any idea. Once the lease was signed, everything became procedural, not emotional. Procedural. That distinction mattered. I didn't pack boxes immediately. I didn't start decluttering dramatically. I didn't change my routine in any visible way. Externally, I was still Nadia, the steady one. Internally, I was executing a timeline. First, finances. I recalculated my monthly budget based solely on my own expenses. Rent, utilities, groceries, insurance, transportation. The numbers aligned comfortably. Not extravagantly, but securely. Then I adjusted my automatic transfers. The mortgage contribution that had once been drafted on the first of every month, I changed it to manual. Not canceled yet. Manual. Control before action. I redirected that amount into my separate savings account temporarily, building a cushion for transition costs, security deposits, moving fees, unexpected overlaps. Next, utilities. Over the course of 2 weeks, I transferred electricity, water, and internet accounts fully into my parents' names. I framed it as cleaning up documentation. Mom didn't question it deeply. That's probably smarter anyway, she said casually. You never know. You never know. The irony almost made me smile. Ethan noticed the internet account email change notification one evening. Why'd that switch? He asked, sissy. It should always have been under the homeowner's name, I replied calmly. He shrugged. Makes sense. No suspicion. People rarely interrogate administrative tidiness. At work, I scheduled my move-in date for a Friday afternoon. I requested a personal day the following Monday to finish settling in. I booked movers quietly during my lunch break. Minimal furniture, clothes, personal documents, my books. I wasn't planning to take anything that could be disputed. No shared items. No symbolic gestures. Just what was indisputably mine. Meanwhile, at home, dinner conversations continued as usual. Mom discussed an upcoming medical appointment. Ethan debated whether to upgrade his car after all. Dad asked about the weather forecasts. I listened, contributed lightly, but I no longer mentally attached my future to their concerns. That was the strangest part. For years, every household issue felt like my responsibility. Now they felt like information. One evening, Mom said, "We'll have to figure out the property tax increase soon." I nodded. "You will." The phrasing slipped out gently. She looked at me briefly, puzzled. "You mean we," she corrected automatically. I held her gaze. "We'll talk about it," I said, not confirming. Silence stretched for half a second too long. Then the conversation shifted. I wasn't hiding my departure out of fear. I was staging it to minimize chaos. There's a difference between leaving impulsively and leaving cleanly. I wanted no loose ends. No leverage held over me later. No emotional claims tied to financial entanglement. On the Wednesday before my move, I withdrew my final mortgage contribution. I didn't announce it. I waited. The auto withdrawal date passed. 2 days later, Mom mentioned casually, "The mortgage payment seemed lower than usual." I kept my voice even. "I adjusted my contribution." She looked up. "Adjusted how?" "I'm reassessing my finances." That was true. She frowned slightly but didn't press. They still believed this was a temporary recalibration, not departure. The boxes began to accumulate in my closet, flattened, silent. I packed only at night, methodical, organized, documents in labeled folders, clothes folded neatly, no frantic energy. The house didn't feel hostile. It felt unaware, and that awareness gap gave me control. By the time moving day approached, everything was in place. Lease signed, utilities transferred, savings secured, mail forwarding scheduled, no debts, no shared contracts, no ambiguity. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a logistical event, and the calmness of it all was what made it powerful. Because when you move in silence, the impact isn't in the noise. It's in the absence that follows. The consequences didn't begin with shouting. They began with confusion. It was the first of the month. The mortgage auto withdrawal processed, lighter than usual, noticeably lighter. I had transferred only a minimal amount. Not the third I'd contributed for years, just enough to avoid abrupt shock. Mom noticed first. "Nadia," she called from the kitchen, holding her phone. "The payment didn't go through correctly." "It did," I replied calmly, stepping into the room. She frowned. "It's short." I adjusted my contribution. Her expression shifted, not anger but uncertainty. "For how long?" she asked. "For now," I said. Ethan looked up from the table. "Wait, why?" "I'm reorganizing my finances," I answered evenly. That phrase again, reorganizing. Dad cleared his throat but said nothing. The room felt slightly tilted, as if gravity had changed direction just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Mom's voice tightened. "We depend on that amount." "I understand," I said, "which is why it's important that we all review the budget together." The word all landed heavily. Ethan's jaw tightened. "So now we're in trouble because you decided to change something?" There it was, the first hint of accusation. "No," I replied, steady. "You're not in trouble. But we've structured things assuming I'll always cover a third. That's not sustainable without discussion." Mom sat down slowly. "Why didn't you talk to us first?" I held her gaze. "I'm talking to you now." Silence. Not explosive, just unsettled. Over the next few days, subtle ripples moved through the house. Mom began reviewing grocery receipts more closely. Ethan mentioned picking up extra shifts. Dad asked questions about refinancing again, but without directing them at me automatically. They were recalibrating, not yet aware that this was only the beginning. The following week, I removed myself as the primary contact for Dad's medical billing accounts. The clinic called the house instead of my cell. Mom sounded flustered afterward. "They kept asking about coverage details," she said. I didn't know what to say. "I can show you how to check," I offered. Her eyes searched my face. "You're being different," she said quietly. "I'm being balanced," I replied. That was when the emotional shift began. Not anger, loss of convenience. They started to feel the weight of tasks I had silently absorbed for years. Not catastrophically. Incrementally. Utility reminders arrived in Mom's inbox. Insurance comparison notices reached Ethan directly. Paperwork lingered longer on the counter. Dinner conversations carried a faint undercurrent of tension. Ethan snapped once when a late fee appeared on a minor account. This never used to happen. I met his frustration without heat. "It did," I said gently. "You just didn't see it." He stared at me, something dawning behind his irritation. The house wasn't collapsing, but it was working harder, and that effort felt foreign to them. One evening, Mom approached me in the hallway. "Are you unhappy here?" she asked suddenly. The question was quiet, vulnerable. I didn't answer immediately. "I've been over-functioning," I said carefully, "and that's not healthy long-term." She blinked. "We never asked you to." I nodded softly. "I know." That was the uncomfortable truth. They hadn't forced me. They had adapted to my willingness, and now they were adapting to my withdrawal. Consequences in families rarely look like explosions. They look like an absence, like effort replacing ease, like realization creeping in slowly. By the end of the month, I noticed something new. They were starting to speak to each other differently. Mom asked Ethan directly about contributions. Ethan reviewed bills without handing them to me. Dad initiated a call to the insurance provider himself. Awkwardly, imperfectly, but independently. They weren't furious. They were destabilized. And somewhere beneath the discomfort, I sensed the beginning of understanding. Not yet about my departure, but about my weight. Hey. For the first time in years, they were experiencing the system without my silent reinforcement. And they didn't like how heavy it felt. They still didn't know I was leaving, but they were starting to feel what it would be like if I did. The official conversation happened 3 days before my move. I hadn't planned a dramatic reveal. I had planned clarity. The movers were scheduled for Friday morning. My lease had already begun. Most of my non-essential items were packed quietly in labeled boxes stacked behind my closet door. I waited until after dinner. Mom was rinsing dishes. Ethan was scrolling through his phone. Dad sat at the table, folding and unfolding a napkin absent-mindedly. "I need to tell you something," I said calmly. All three looked up. "I've signed a lease. I'm moving out on Friday." There it was. No build-up. No emotional performance. Just a fact. For a second, no one reacted. The words seemed to hover in the air. Unreal. Mom laughed softly, an instinctive denying, "You're joking." "I'm not." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Ethan straightened. "Wait, you're leaving? "Yes." "Why?" Mom's voice wasn't angry. It was confused, hurt. I met her eyes. "Because I need a life that isn't structured around holding everything together here." Her hands tightened around the edge of the sink. "We didn't ask you to hold everything together." "I know," I said gently, "but I've been doing it, and it's shaped my entire adult life." Dad finally spoke, his voice low. "Is this about money?" "It's about balance," I replied. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "So you just decided this on your own, without talking to us?" "Yes." The honesty stung them more than any dramatic explanation would have. Mom stepped toward me. "We could have fixed it. If you were overwhelmed, we could have adjusted." I felt a flicker of sadness, not guilt, sadness. "You're adjusting now," I said quietly. Her expression shifted. She understood the implication. The mortgage contribution, the utilities, the paperwork. All of it had been preparation, not moodiness. "You've been planning this," she whispered. "Yes." The room felt smaller. Ethan's voice sharpened. "This is sudden." "It's not," I said evenly. "It's just the first time I've said it out loud." That was the truth they struggled with most. To them, it felt abrupt. To me, it had been months of recalibration. Mom's eyes filled, not dramatically, but with the dawning awareness that something structural was ending. "We're family," she said. "Yes," I replied, "and I'm not disappearing. I'm just no longer living here." "But we depend on you," she said. The sentence slipped out before she could soften it. There it was. Depend. Not love. Not miss. Depend. I didn't react harshly. "That's part of the problem," I said calmly. Silence again. No one shouted. No one accused. But the realization settled heavily across the table. They had grown accustomed to my presence as infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't announce departure. It simply stops operating. Mom tried once more. "Stay a little longer. Let us figure things out properly." "I've already given you years," I said gently. "You're capable." Ethan looked away, jaw tight. Dad nodded slowly, as if piecing together something he had sensed but never articulated. It was too late to fix. Not because reconciliation was impossible, but because the decision wasn't reactionary. It was deliberate, and deliberate choices are rarely reversible. That night, the house felt different, not angry, grieving. They moved around me more carefully. Conversations were shorter, quieter. The system had finally recognized the structural shift. But by the time a system realizes its reliance on something, the departure is already in motion. And mine was. The morning I left was almost painfully ordinary. No thunderstorm, no dramatic silence, no packed suitcases lined up by the door like a movie scene. Just cardboard boxes, a rented truck, coffee brewing in the kitchen. The movers arrived at 9 a.m. Mom stood near the hallway, arms folded tightly, not defensive, just holding herself together. Ethan hovered in the living room, restless. Dad sat at the dining table, watching quietly as my bookshelf was emptied. No one tried to physically stop me. That mattered. As the last box was carried out, I walked through the house one final time. My bedroom, bare walls, faint outlines where frames once hung. The kitchen, countertops I had leaned against for years while managing bills and conversations. The hallway, where I had stood holding medical statements the night everything shifted. I picked up my silver key from the ceramic dish by the front door. It felt lighter than I expected. Mom approached me slowly. "You're really doing this," she said. "I am." Her voice trembled slightly. "It feels like you're leaving us." "I'm leaving the role," I replied gently, "not the relationship." Ethan stepped forward. "So what, you'll just visit now, like a guest?" "If that's what's healthy," I said calmly. He shook his head. "You didn't even fight with us, you just planned." That was the part that unsettled him most. There had been no explosion to blame, no argument to dissect, just quiet execution. "I didn't want to fight," I said. "I wanted alignment." Dad stood up then slowly. "You should have said something sooner," he said. "I did," I answered softly, just not loudly. The room fell still. Mom looked at the key in my hand. "After everything we've been through," she whispered, "this feels final." I stepped closer to her. It's not final," I said. "It's necessary." And then I did the thing I had imagined so many times. Not with anger, not with theatrics. I placed the silver key on the small entryway table, not thrown in rage. Placed. From now on, I am no longer part of this household. The words were steady, clear, not sharp. Ethan inhaled sharply. Mom covered her mouth. Dad closed his eyes briefly. "I love you," I added, "but I can't live here as infrastructure anymore." There was no rebuttal, no raised voices, just the heavy recognition that something irreversible had occurred. Mom's eyes searched my face. "Will you be okay?" She asked quietly. I almost smiled. "Yes," I said. I already am." That was the truth. I wasn't leaving in pain. I was living in clarity. The movers called from outside, signaling they were finished loading. I picked up my purse. No dramatic hug. Just brief, restrained embraces. Ethan's grip was tighter than usual. Dad held my shoulder longer than he ever had. Mom's hug lingered, but she didn't beg. As I stepped through the doorway, I didn't look back immediately. Not because I was cold, but because I needed to walk forward without hesitation. Outside, the air felt different. Not freer in a cinematic way, just mine. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and allowed myself one final glance at the house. It didn't look angry. It looked quiet. And for the first time in years, so did I. The first night in my apartment was quieter than I expected. Not lonely, just quiet in a way that didn't require vigilance. There were no subtle tensions humming beneath the walls. No unfinished conversations lingering in the air. No bills sitting on a counter waiting for me to anticipate them. Just exposed brick, soft city light filtering through tall windows, the faint hum of traffic below. I sat on the hardwood floor with my back against the wall, surrounded by half-opened boxes. For the first time in years, nothing needed my immediate attention. That stillness felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I caught myself listening for someone calling my name. Nadia? No one did. I made dinner that night. Simple pasta, olive oil, salt. I ate at my small kitchen counter, standing up, looking out at the street below. The food tasted the same, but I wasn't performing stability while eating it. I was simply present. Over the next few weeks, something subtle but profound unfolded. I woke up without scanning a mental checklist of shared responsibilities. I paid my own bills, only mine. I arranged my furniture not for practicality, but preference. I signed up for a weekend writing workshop I'd postponed for years. I stayed late at work because I wanted to, not because home demanded less from me emotionally. The identity shift wasn't dramatic. No sudden reinvention, no drastic haircut, no symbolic purge of the past. It was quieter than that. I stopped introducing myself internally as the one who holds everything together. I started introducing myself as Nadia, just Nadia. My phone rang more often in the first month. Mom is asking how to navigate a billing portal. Ethan is checking in, sometimes awkwardly. Dad leaving brief voicemails. Just seeing how you're doing. I answered when I wanted to. I helped when it felt healthy. But I no longer stepped in preemptively. There was space now between request and response. That space was mine. One evening, Mom said during a call, "We're figuring things out. It's harder than I thought." I didn't rush to solve it. "I know you can." And I meant it. The strangest realization came slowly. They didn't collapse without me. They adjusted. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. And that truth removed the last layer of guilt I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I hadn't abandoned them. I had trusted them. Meanwhile, I began noticing changes in myself. I spoke differently in meetings, like less cautious, more direct. I declined invitations without elaborate explanations. I spent Sunday mornings reading instead of organizing other people's documents. I wasn't less loving. I was less overextended. There's a version of strength that looks like endurance, and there's a version that looks like boundary. For most of my life, I practiced the first. Now I practice the second. When I think about that house, I don't feel bitterness. I feel context. It shaped me. It taught me resilience. It revealed my blind spots. But it is no longer the container for my identity. I'm still responsible, still steady, still capable. But those traits belong to me now, not to a role assigned by default. I didn't leave because I hated them. I left because I finally understood that love without balance becomes quite self-erasing. And I am no longer willing to disappear in order to be dependable. I am Nadia, not infrastructure, not the buffer, not the automatic solution. Just a woman who chose alignment over endurance. And that choice changed everything. It's been a year since I placed my key on that entryway table. A year since I walked out empty-handed. A year since I chose clarity over comfort. If you had asked me back then whether I was afraid, I would have said yes, but not of failure. I was afraid of being misunderstood, of being seen as ungrateful, dramatic, selfish. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to stop quietly absorbing what was never meant to be yours alone. My family and I still speak. Not every day, not about everything. But the dynamic is different now. When my mother asks for help, she asks. When my brother needs advice, he acknowledges it. When my father calls, it's to talk, not to transfer responsibility. There is more space in our conversations. And space, I've learned, is not distance. It's respect. Walking away didn't destroy my family. It revealed it. It revealed how much I had overfunctioned. It revealed how capable they actually were. And most importantly, it revealed how deeply I had confused usefulness with worth. I used to believe that being indispensable was a form of love. Now I understand that love without reciprocity slowly erases you. And disappearing inside a role, even a responsible one, is not loyalty. It's self-abandonment. With nothing but my resolve, I walked away from the only home I had ever known, and from the family that no longer felt like mine. But what I truly walked away from was a version of myself that believed endurance was the highest virtue. Quiet dominance isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about knowing your value so clearly that you no longer need to negotiate it through sacrifice. If you've ever been the steady one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't need much, I hope you ask yourself something gently tonight. Are you staying because you want to, or because everyone assumes you will? I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever stepped out of a role that everyone else thought you'd play forever?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.